I want to start this episode by sharing a quick personal story. So, for about 6 years, I barely touched any short form content. I simply wasn't interested in endless scrolling, and life felt way more stable and productive. But recently, I slipped back into the habit of scrolling here and there just for a few minutes, which turned into a little more each time. And before I knew it, I felt more irritable, anxious, and scatterbrained than I had in years. And it was a rude awakening, and I realized I had to relearn the lesson that life is far better without an endless feed of 10-second dopamine hits. So, today we talk about short form content and why I believe it's mostly not conducive to a productive life. And my caveat here, if you watch short form content and you have a great life, more power to you. You do you. You do what works for you. And if you are new here to this podcast, I'm Nicola. I'm a 27-year-old entrepreneur, and here I share the many mistakes and lessons I'm learning along the way. So I expect episodes about high performance and business. So please share and enjoy. And hopefully you like my podcast, Catch the Zenith. Now, I want to start with a proper definition. Everybody talks nowadays about short form content, and more or less people know what we are talking about. But to make it entirely sure or very sure that we know what we are talking about, here's my attempt to define short form content. I define short form content as any piece of content that's quick to consume, usually under 60 seconds, and it can come or appear in video or in a few sentences, so in text. So video is more like Instagram Reels, maybe TikTok, and text is more like, let's say, X or Twitter. And its goal is basically to grab attention fast, deliver value or emotion instantly, and keep people engaged in a feed-based, low-attention environment. So long story short, basically, little short-form content, 60 seconds or less, that's the, let's say, amount of time that is required to consume that piece of content. And there are various definitions out there, but for the sake of this episode, I try to use this definition. Now, what I've observed these days that many people are glued to short-form content. Whether it's YouTube Shorts, TikTok, or Instagram Reels, many of us end up scrolling mindlessly for far too long. And I give you an example. I work out 5 times a week, sometimes a little bit more, 6 sessions perhaps. And in the gym I see many people like literally doing, I think that's what I think they are doing, like sometimes a doom scroll, and they do very, very long breaks between sets. And because it's so seductive, obviously, to scroll on social media and get another dopamine hit, and also in other instances, when I'm commuting via train, for instance, many people use their phone, and obviously it can have some productive applications. I'm not denying that, not at all. I see it also as a Swiss Army knife, my phone. But I think nowadays many people struggle with that, and I include myself in that group, that the phone can really grab our attention, and not always in a productive manner. So my observation, we spend a lot of time on our phones, and to make it more precise, a lot of time on social media, for instance. And we are often told that this habit destroys our attention span and sparks endless comparison if we are on social media, as we see Ferraris, six-packs, the perfect bodies, or perfect lifestyle. And that alone sounds perhaps bad enough, but it turns out the issue runs deeper and more sinister. So we have those, let's say, more shallow thing everybody talks about, that everybody has now a goldfish focus time, like we have a focus span of a goldfish. We compare ourselves, etc. Everybody talks about, but I think it's way deeper than that, the negative effect it can have on our lives. In fact, short-form content, or short-form videos, more precise, can overload our brain with a roller coaster of extreme and often conflicting emotions. If you felt inexplicably angry or anxious or just drained after scrolling, you may have experienced what I would call an emotional hangover. And it's not something you want to take lightly, at least from my perspective. So now the question, why so many emotions all at once? And I think each swipe brings up a brand new hit of emotional intensity. And that's exactly what I think sometimes is missed out in the discussion around short-form content. 1 second you see a feel-good clip of, let's say, a cancer survivor celebrating life, and the next clip you see, you're thrown into a politically charged rant that fuels your anger. And you swipe again, and you're jealous of someone flaunting a lavish lifestyle. And a few swipes later, you're inspired by an motivational speaker. Another swipe, you stumble upon tragic news. Next swipe, comedic relief, comedy, and on and on and on. All within minutes. And that's the crazy part. Within a matter of maybe 10 minutes, you've experienced so many different emotions. Anger, sadness, feeling happy. And our brain obviously needs energy to process everything. And I remember I felt sometimes like really that my brain was literally fried by so many impressions I got within a matter of, few minutes. And what is now the consequence? What's the result of that behavior? From my perspective, an endless buffet of emotional spikes that your brain has to process in record time. And our emotions, whether it's anger, sadness, motivation, joy, envy, you name it, don't simply appear out of thin air. They are grounded in real neurochemical changes. When you surf 10 emotional waves in 2 minutes, it's like shifting a car from first gear to sixth gear and back to first over and over and over again. It's like you can think of a car. You're in first gear, going into sixth gear, then again first, and on and on and on. You continue that, and obviously that requires some effort of the car or of your brain. So those ups and downs of emotions is pretty mentally demanding, at least from my perspective. Now, and that's, I think, the important part that's sometimes missed out, the emotional aspect. And let's continue with emotional hangover and sensitivity, because I see them associated with that domain or with that topic. Because when these chemicals surges pile up, your brain essentially stumbles into an emotional hangover state. You don't have the time or space to resolve each feeling before the next wave hits. And eventually, you might feel frazzled, numb, or on edge, like your brain is fried. Maybe I feel like that. I described it before, but it's really like, if you go for, let's say, a 3-hour doom scroll of mainly short-form content, I've never heard someone saying, I felt great after such a session. There's so many impressions. And if I compare that to a nice walk in nature, I feel way more calm after a walk, as opposed to watching short-form content. And this overflow of dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and other neurotransmitters checks up your emotional sensitivity. Again, if we watch short-form content. And soon, even the tiniest real-life problem sets you off, whether it's a mild disagreement with a friend or a trivial inconvenience at work. And some of the problems we label as mental health issues might partially stem from binging short, high intensity clips that keep our brains in perpetual overdrive. That's also an interesting topic to explore, perhaps. I'm not an expert in that. I'm not claiming here in any way that I'm an expert in short form content, whatever. That is just pure bro science, what I'm now talking about, this entire episode. But I think it could have also a connection with certain mental health issues, perhaps. Nowadays, a lot of people talk about ADD or ADHD. And from my perspective, at least, lifestyle changes, or your lifestyle, like what you eat, what information you consume, in what form, do you sleep well, do you work out, all those kind of things, they can have perhaps an impact. And at least I see it from that perspective. And I think short form content can have a huge effect, because imagine like every single day for 3, 4, 5 hours you spend binging short form content, and you have those emotional roller coasters, and you get more irritable, and you are more sensitive to negative stuff, but also to positive stuff. So you're more volatile. And being more volatile has maybe some upsides. You can be spontaneous, but it can also have downsides, because you don't have yourself so much under your control. Perhaps your impulse control, and I define here impulse control as your ability to influence your behavior if you get a stimulus, basically. So let's do an example. If you're standing in a queue, you're waiting for your Chipotle bowl, and you get a notification, and you can't resist the urge to check your phone right now. You perhaps don't have such strong impulse control. However, if you resist the urge to check your phone when getting a notification, perhaps your impulse control is a little bit stronger. And we will cover that in a second, because impulse control is a very important part could be a remedy to, let's say, emotional hangover. All right, so let's do a quick recap what we covered so far. We talked about there are so many emotions that are associated when we consume short-form content. Anger, feeling happy, sadness, etc., you name it. And then we talked about emotional hangover. So if we consume too much short-form content, our brains feel like fried. We have emotional hangover. Now the question is, how can we overcome I'm not sure if I would call it addiction, but let's say our tendency to watch a lot of short-form content. And I'm going to share the tactics that helped me over the past years, because I had pretty intense periods where I was really pretty much in monk mode. So basically very honed in on my work. I was only working, I was reading books, I was working out, I was eating a healthy diet, and I'm still more or less doing that. But unfortunately I had recently a long period where I fall a little bit back in that old behavior which I had before, like spending a little bit more time on YouTube and consuming a little bit more news on YouTube, and I didn't feel pretty good about it. And now, by the way, I started a new season in my life, and maybe to give you a quick insight into what is a season. A season is a time period where you focus more or less on one thing. You say maybe no to social commitments and yes to work. But a season can also be you work less and you focus more on your family or your friends, for instance. So there are different seasons to life. And it's a little bit like a lion. You hunt an animal, then you kill the animal, you eat the animal, you reassess, and you hunt the next animal. So it's really, I think Naval Ravikant used that analogy. It's really, we work great, or a lot of humans work great, not as, let's say, working, let's say, jobs where a lot of stuff is required that is boring, like repeatable stuff that doesn't require a lot of cognitive attention. But we are very good at creative stuff and working intense for a period and then reassessing, etc. All this to say that a new season started now in my life, because I started a sales job in a B2B software company or startup, and pretty happy about that. And now again, I went back to my normal routine of like honing in, working my 12 hours per day, and no short form content, just reading books and podcasts, maybe a little bit music during the gym session in the evening. But that's it. And that's more or less what I actually did for the past 6 or even more years. And I felt pretty good about that. And by the way, in that period, really, sometimes I had, for instance, I use social media, for instance, just for my podcast to let people know about the stuff I have, like here, like this podcast. But I don't go on other profiles. I'm not following what my friends are doing. That's really something I very, very rarely do. And if I go on another profile, let's say I go on Chris Williamson's profile, which is a successful podcast, I go there to get some inspiration how I could structure my short form content. But apart from that, it's really zero. And I'm very consequent with that. But if I don't do it, and recently I wasn't that consistent, I don't feel as good as I could feel. Because I know how good I feel if I really live a deep, focused life. Cal Newport, the author of the book Deep Work, talks a lot about living a deep life, living a focused, meaningful, purposeful life. And short-form content has, at least from my perspective, no space if you want to live a deep, focused, meaningful life, because it's draining your energy, it's reducing it impairs your ability to focus. It has more downsides than upsides, at least from my perspective, because also if I try to see the upsides in consuming short-form content, there are some upsides, at least for me, for my podcast. I can make people interested in my podcast and direct them to the long-form content, so my actual podcast. I can upload some snippets. But apart from that, if I would use it purely from a, let's say, normal consumerist user, so I would maybe upload every month a picture, maybe every 2 weeks, sometimes a story that I'm with friends, and then I scroll and see what my other friends are doing. I've done that in the past when I was 18, 19 years old, maybe 20, I'm not sure, but for sure around 17, 18, 19 years old. That was my prime time, because during that time I was a little bit more impulsive. I wasn't that strictly following my healthy habits. And that during that time, I consumed that short form content and I knew how I felt about it. And if I compare that to my life that I'm having right now, or mostly over the past 6 years, it's just two different, not entirely different lives, but it's very better. More productive, more impulse control, focused, you're stable throughout the day. That's a very cool part of it. And obviously other lifestyle parts also have an impact on that. But I think short-form content is a crucial puzzle in the entire jigsaw puzzle, basically. A piece in the entire one. So now I want to give you a quick quote here of Naval Ravikant, who is a successful entrepreneur. He said, "You're born, you have a whole set of sensory experiences and stimulations, so lights, colors, and sounds, and then you die. How you choose to interpret them is up to you. You have that choice." This quote underlines that our entire life, we see stuff, we experience stuff, we hear stuff, and how we react to those things is entirely up to us. Why I'm bringing that up here? Because how we structure our lives, what we consume, how we react on what we consume is entirely our decision. At least that's how I try to approach it from a proactive standpoint. And based on that, I want to make the argument that you have totally under your control what you consume, obviously, and how you react to it. And that lies a little bit the mindset for the tactics I'm going to share with you that help me to live a focused life where short form content has no place. The first one being replacement. When someone talks about dopamine detox, not consuming short-form content, no social media, I think that's already a cool start. But what's often get missed out here in the equation is you need to replace it with a different behavior. If you stop behavior A, you need to start or you need to replace it with another behavior B. If you want to stop eating junk food in the evening, you need to replace it with something. Replace it, obviously with healthy food, for instance, or you need to also find a different activity, what you're going to do during that time, because perhaps you was binging 3 hours in the evening, you went to open the fridge multiple times, the refrigerator, and get another whatever chips or let's say whatever you have unhealthy food in your fridge. But if you replace that activity with working out for, let's say, 1 hour, you already replaced a part of that time. And that's an important, I think, a crucial part here. It's like when we want to stop watching short-form content, okay, with what piece of information we're going to replace it? Maybe with long-form content. Instead of 3 hours binging short-form, we could say, let's go for a podcast that's 3 hours long. And there are many long podcasts out there. Joe Rogan, Huberman, Jordan Peterson, Alex Hormozi perhaps sometimes, Chris Williamson, etc. And see what it does with you. But you try to replace it. If you entirely cut out a habit or behavior out of your life without thinking, okay, what I'm going to do instead, it can be challenging. Anyway, it will be challenging, but then we already have an idea, okay, what I'm going to do different now, which new or other behavior I'm going to adopt. So the first tactic that helped me is replacement. For instance, instead of going out for a party, I go to work out, or I go stay at home and watch a long-form podcast. So I try to replace it with something that maybe could make my life better. And I did that in various forms. That's just some top of the mind things I did. So working out is a great one, or sleeping earlier. That's also a good one, yeah. If you, back then when I was 18 and going out and doing party, and after a certain period, over the years, I started to sleep on consistent bedtimes more or less. So I went earlier to bed, and if I go earlier to bed, I'm not going out, obviously. I'm not going for a party, you know. So that's something, what I did. Second, impulse control. Impulse control, we discussed that many times on this podcast. Very important part. Impulse control, your ability to say no, your ability to resist something, the ability to say yes to this and no to that. And we defined it already before. You can train your impulse control with various things. Example, everyday situations are a great way to start. If you're waiting in a queue, you get that notifications, we talked before about that, and you want to pull out your phone, don't do it in that moment. Try to resist the urge. The best case is actually you turn off your notification entirely. And also if you don't get any notifications, we sometimes have maybe the tendency to just pull out our phones and start using our phones, and in that moment just to enjoy the boredom. Or while working, if you work something, you do a focus session, you're not allowed to use your phone. And if you do that for 90 minutes, for 2 hours, for 5 hours, for 6 hours, over and over again, you train your impulse control. I'm a point where I can focus for very, very extended periods of times. And the reason for that is because I did it many, many times. And I turn off my notifications. I don't use my phone. If I use it, then it has something to do with work. I need to open Authenticator app to open an account or log in to something. But no distractions. That trains the impulse control. The same with food. I realize that if I eat healthy food, my impulse control is way better as opposed to eating junk food. Because eating junk food and eating too much junk food is in itself impulsive behavior. You can't control yourself properly. That's the thing that I think nowadays people talk a lot about, and that's a whole different discussion. People celebrate obese people, and you can have your opinion. What's fact in the end that this person eats too much. That's just the way we gain weight. We eat too much, and I think, and because I experienced myself, I was for a certain period a little bit not overweight, but I had a little bit more of my a little bit more fat in my body, and I knew how my behavior was at that time. If I compare it with the behavior I had later on, when I got shredded, when I got lean and working out and eating a good diet, that's a different thing. I'll have myself way more under control. And again, this is a different discussion, but this is just my experience I had. If you're, let's say, obese, if you're fat, it's harder for you to say no to something on average. And there are some exceptions, obviously, but that's how I experienced it. Then, also music is an interesting thing, how we can train our impulse control. If I listen every workout to music, I feel like I have this music hangover. Maybe you have experienced that. You listen so much music, after a few days you don't experience that much joy when pulling out your phone and start playing music. But if I listen maybe on 1 or 2 days per week music, it's way more exciting. And because the stimulation is lower throughout the week, and then you have maybe 1 or 2 days where you go for the workout, you need an extra energy boost, and you listen to the music and it feels awesome. So also with music, because music obviously is pretty, I think, conducive to dopamine spikes. If you listen to a cool track of whatever you like. So also with music, I think we can train ourselves, like to have certain day where we listen podcasts in the gym or general podcasts, and other days where we listen music. And sometimes listening to nothing at all is also a cool thing. Do that sometimes in the gym where I just listen nothing. So sometimes even with noise cancelling, although that's sometimes for me a little bit, for myself, creepy. I feel a little bit lonely just with no sounds at all. But yeah, that's how I try to train myself a bit. And also, yeah, podcasts, books are great strategy. Podcasts I love because it's long-form content. You need to listen. You need to maybe also watching the video form. So you need to watch just that video. You don't read the comments. You don't consume something else. And the same with books. What I particularly love about reading books is the book you don't continue reading if you don't continue. Quite an obvious one. But if you listen to a podcast and the podcast ends, it continues to the next one. Or the same with a Netflix era. If one episode is over, it says 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it goes to the next one automatically. And with books, you need to put in the effort, the focus, the energy. And it can be, and especially nowadays, it's hard sometimes. If you're used to consuming all day long short-form content and not books, reading the first time a book for 10, 20, 30 minutes, quite challenging, maybe. Not everybody, but I think I struggle with that for sure. But the more we do that, the better we get at it. And you know, the cool thing is you train your focus by simply reading books and you learn something, especially if you read self-help books. So I think a great habit and a great way to train our impulse control. So impulse control you can train with food, with music, with podcasts, with books, with deep work sessions where you're not allowed to use your phone. And also in everyday situations like you're waiting in a queue, you want to pull out your phone but you don't do it. Another thing I quickly touched upon was living a deep life. And I define that as living a focused, purposeful, meaningful life. And still sounds a little bit vague, but it's simply, let's put it like that. How you do one thing is how you do everything. The same focus you deploy when working, you deploy when you're with your family, with your friends. You try to live an intense, meaningful, deep life that is grounded in good values, hopefully. And you see, perhaps I haven't entirely thought it through, but it's just a nice name how I can put that into it's like the umbrella term for living a good life, perhaps. And within a deep life, there is how you do one thing, how you do everything, and deep work, shallow work. But also, again, the thing of you need to train yourself to resist the temptations of life. And temptations can come from various things. Various things try to seduce us all the time. And every decision can change entirely our lives. Literally, one decision can destroy our relationship with our partner. Let's say, one bad decision while driving can end our lives. But one good decision can bring us to a nice somewhere in holidays. If you read the sign correctly and you go on the right, you end up at a nice place. But the left could go totally in a different direction. So, all this to say that living a deep life with focus, with intensity, is hard. It's a hard life, but I think it's worth it. And it's a good long-term strategy to go the hard path over the easy path. Because from a shallow perspective, if you look at the easy path, it's obviously easier. But the downside is it lacks adventure. And I found myself like I'm seeking adventure. And adventure is part of a deep life. And we find adventure by taking on responsibility. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about that. And by speaking the truth. That's another discussion, but yeah. Now I drifted a little bit off, but all this to say that, living a deep life is also part of the philosophy where short-form content has no place. That's a little bit more big picture, if that makes any sense. Now, so I give you some strategies with replacement, impulse control, stuff like that. We could also maybe quickly touch upon deep work and shallow work. Deep work, no distraction, shallow work, more multitasking, but still in a time block. But you might reject right now that, hey, Nicola, you're still using short-form content on social media. You have an Instagram account, you post about your podcast, etc. And that's a good point. That's a valid point. But Hormozy once said the following. The point of short-form content is to drive them to long-form. That's the goal here. And I think that also describes pretty accurately what I try to do with my Instagram. I try to give you a teaser, a snippet of what you can expect of my podcast episode that I just uploaded. And I think like using social media like this, it's still conducive to this project and to my life. However, I'm not a big fan of, it's 60 seconds if you upload a reel maybe, or maybe 30 seconds or a minute and 30 seconds, whatever. And it lacks context. It lacks sometimes substance. And the ability that someone will learn a lot from one single short-form clip is maybe. Sometimes it doesn't need a lot of words to convey a message. But if you consume too much of that, it gets lost. If you watch 30, 40, 50 short-form videos, I think most people will forget almost everything they watched in the past 1, 2, 3 hours. All this to say that if you say you're hypocritical with you still have Instagram, fair enough. But myself, I try not to consume that content on other profiles. I try to be a creator rather than a consumer. So more creating and less consuming. So in this episode, I tried to make the point of that short-form content can lead to emotional roller coasters. Short-form content, like all tools, can be helpful, maybe, I still think in most cases not, or harmful, depending on how we use it. But if you notice yourself stuck in emotional quicksand or flaring up at the slightest provocation, it might be a sign that your brain's gears are shifting too fast and too often. You might remember that quick analogy I used before with the gear of a car. Sometimes the best thing we can do is consciously opt out of the emotional frenzy, at least for a while. And if you want more clarity, sharper focus, and a calmer mind, consider stepping away from the perpetual scroll and giving your brain the breathing room it needs. And also, if you try to replace short-form content, replace it with something productive, with something conducive to your overall well-being. Alright, that's it, guys. Thanks for listening. If you found that episode valuable, I have a little bonus for you. I've put together a free list of the 100 plus podcast episodes to listen to before you die. Simply the episodes I listened over the past 5-6-ish years that I enjoyed the most. So if you want that list, click the link below and download it for free and get subscribed to my newsletter as well. Thank you guys. Have a good week.